A reading from Amos, the 5th chapter. Alas, for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatty animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is the word of the Lord. On February 5th, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, entitled The American Dream. As part of that speech, with the goal of creating an action program to get rid of the vestiges of segregation and discrimination, King said that it is a myth that time will simply take care of the problems of segregation and discrimination. With his typical rhetorical force, he said, "Somewhere along the way of life, we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so it is necessary for us to help time and forever realize that the time is always right to do right." The time is always right to do right. In a very profound sense, that was the message God sent through the prophet Amos when he said, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." It's that ever-flowing stream of righteousness, that instruction to do right and make things right that MLK was proclaiming. And of course, our inclination may be to nod along in agreement with both Amos and King. The thing is, even though time alone cannot heal the brokenness of the world, time has cloaked both of these prophets with respectability. Yet it's crucial for us to know that both of these figures were in many ways unwelcome messengers in their day. In the 60s, when Martin Luther King Jr. was advocating for civil rights and leading nonviolent resistance efforts, he and his message made countless people uncomfortable and upset. His words and actions put his own life in peril until, as we know, he was ultimately assassinated. King disrupted people's complacency and challenged systems of oppression. And for that, he lost his life, all the while highlighting and advancing the cause of civil rights and the equality of all people. Now, today we have a national holiday in his honor, but in his day, he had epithets and threats thrown at him constantly. But Amos, well, this guy's got a book in the Bible, so he must have been popular. I mean, he's not just some guy, right? People must have liked him. No, not at all. You see, we may have cloaked the biblical prophets with respectability and acceptance because their words are contained in what we consider to be Holy Scripture. and because we have the space of centuries and millennia between their words and today. But true biblical prophets were wild and untamed. They shared messages that were and are challenging to hear and even harder to live out. As the great Jewish writer and theologian Abraham Heschel described them, prophets hear things with too high a level of intensity. They have no time for complacency. You see, God never sends a prophet to bring the message, hey, just take it easy. Change nothing, you're doing a good job, carry on. You see, a prophet is not a middle manager trying to make sure everyone is happy and content. Instead, a prophet comes with a fiery and difficult message. Fiery because it's a message from the Lord. It's a divine word, a message of unadulterated truth. And it's difficult because it always calls people to change. And as I've heard it put, no one likes change other than a wet baby. So it is, just as MLK's words would years later thunder and roll against the injustices of racism in American culture and society, Amos's words thundered and rolled against the people of Israel, the northern kingdom. You see, the people had grown comfortable, which made them complacent, because life was good for them. They were well fed, and they were prosperous. But God sent Amos to shine a light into the deeper reality that the people's comfort was built upon oppressive and unjust practices. Unfair business practices and an economic system that unfairly burdened the poor ruled the day and ruled the hearts of the comfortable, complacent people, who would dutifully gather for worship and ignore the fact that the very faithfulness they professed in worship was not being lived out in their lives. Through the voice of Amos, God condemns this cozy way of life and those lazy worship practices, saying, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You see, the problem for the people of Israel wasn't that they weren't respectable, polite, and civil enough. The problem was that they were too respectable, polite, and civil. They made no waves. They simply fit in with the world around them. So Amos was telling them, the time is right to turn around. Turn around to face God again. Turn around your inauthentic worship. Turn around your unjust business practices. Turn around to see the poor and neglected among you. Now, our sermon theme this summer is favorites. And today's Bible reading from Amos is not a favorite of mine because it warms my heart or gives me peace. Not at all. I consider it a favorite because it makes me uncomfortable. It disrupts me in my own complacency, and it causes me to assess my life of faith and worship and service. It's far easier for me to seek my own comfort and well-being while ignoring the injustice and brokenness around me, both near and far. It's easier for me to insulate myself from the problems of the world and to get involved in the messiness and inconvenience that comes with taking these words from Amos seriously. And I worry that we often fall into the trap of going along to get along, by not making waves, by not speaking up, by not claiming that our identity as followers of Jesus radically shapes and changes us. And I worry that the church, to those outside it, can look at times like a social club, and an exclusive social club at that. I worry that we tend to seek after respectability and comfort more than we seek after God and God's justice. Now, typically, we think of justice as meaning that people get what they deserve. Yet that's not what God's justice is about. God's justice is about setting the world to rights. It's about aligning life and creation with God's intentions. It's about the wholeness of humanity and creation. And God's justice is inseparable from God's inexhaustible love. There's room at God's table for everyone, and God's justice is about the restoration of our oneness with God and one another. So that's why Jesus says something as challenging as, love your enemies. Because God's justice is the full expression of God's love. As MLK said in that speech, God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race and the creation of a society where all will live together and everyone will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Now, that's certainly a lofty goal, but since it's God's goal, as expressed both by the prophet Amos and as witnessed through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, since it's God's goal, then it becomes our goal too. And I absolutely believe that MLK was correct. The time is always right to do right. Now, you may be one of those exceptional people who have been in worship for 2 consecutive weeks in the summer. That may be you. And you may be wondering, whoa, wait a second here. Last week we heard be still, and now we're hearing do right. What gives? Well, on the surface, be still and know that I am God seems to somehow be in opposition to the time is always right to do right. Yet if our posture is to begin by being still and listening for God's voice and God's direction, by acknowledging that God is indeed God, well, that's how we can know what is right and be encouraged by God to go ahead and do it. Again, if we begin by being still and knowing that God is God, we will be empowered to do right because we will see ourselves as God's co-workers. Reggie McNeil puts it this way: the church was created on purpose for a purpose, to partner with God in God's redemptive mission here on earth. And since we know that there is suffering and brokenness and injustice around us, God calls us and trusts us to work with God to bring health and wholeness and dignity. The pernicious effects of racism and sexism and economic injustice ripple around us. Hunger and homophobia are daily realities that denigrate the dignity of so many children of God. And we live in a time where the sad reality is not if there will be another school shooting, but when. And the list goes on and on. And it's an uncomfortable thing, and it may overwhelm or upset us. Yet God has given each one of us a sphere of influence. You have a sphere of influence. Now, none of us can fix all of what's wrong in the world, but there are people and partnerships and situations and circumstances, both great and small, where you have a voice, where you hold sway, where your actions make a definite difference. And the words of the prophet Amos hopefully compel you and every one of us to use our sphere of influence to partner with God to bring about God's justice. Family, friends, neighborhoods, communities, work, nation, world, who you are and what you do matter. And if your life is pretty good. And we'll define that as you know where your next meal's coming from, you've got a roof overhead, clothes on your back, and maybe a friend or two. If your life is pretty good, just think about how you can use your gifts, all of which come from God, to do right and seek God's justice. Because I hope and I pray that we take the words of the prophet Amos seriously. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. As co-workers with God, we are invited to use our influence and imagination to do right. And there's no reason to wait. The time is always right to do right. Amen.